If you grew up near the Appalachian Mountains, you already know. Folks don't just make up stories out here, they remember them. I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. It's wild how many of us are sitting in the dark, listening to the same story, scattered across different corners of the country. Hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find their way into these woods, whether they should or not. Let's start. My name's Caleb Mercer, and I was 34 when this happened. I wasn't a ranger, not a biologist, not even someone who belonged in those mountains. I was a freelance surveyor hired by the county to map out abandoned structures for liability assessments. The kind of bureaucratic work nobody wants to do, but everyone insists gets done so lawsuits don't come crawling in later. My jobs were usually old barns, derelict mining sheds, a cabin someone swore still existed, but hadn't seen since their grandfather's time. But this one was different. The assignment was out by a place called Ashen Fork, on the western slopes near the Monongahela. Not many people live out there anymore, small coal towns that dried up, a scattering of farms left to rot. The county's record said there was a forgotten ranger lookout tower tucked off the ridge, one that hadn't been logged in decades. They wanted photos, a condition report, maybe an estimate for whether it was worth tearing down before some drunk hunter or curious teenager fell through rotten wood. I took the job for the paycheck. I wasn't interested in ghost stories, though the locals had plenty. Folks in Elkins told me that whole slope was bad ground, that the Cherokee avoided it long before settlers came. They said voices carried wrong in the hollows there, like echoes that didn't belong to you. But that was just mountain talk, the kind you hear everywhere in Appalachia if you linger long enough. I told myself none of that mattered. It was late October when I drove out there. The sky had that flat gray look, heavy with the kind of clouds that never quite decide whether to rain. I parked by an old logging road choked with weeds and started walking with my pack, compass, camera, notebook, sidearm. I liked to be prepared, even though my line of work rarely demanded it. The climb started gentle. Hickories, sugar maples, the last of the leaves twisting down like bits of copper. The air had that iron-like tang that comes before snow. I remember noticing how my own boots seemed to echo, even though the forest should have swallowed sound. Every snap of a twig traveled farther than it ought to. About 2 miles in, the markers vanished. There had been orange blazes on the trees, faded, but there. Then suddenly nothing. I circled the area, thinking maybe I missed one. But the woods looked scrubbed clean. Bark smooth as if no one had ever touched it. I pressed on with the compass, trusting the coordinates I'd been given. The ridge was steeper than the topo map suggested, and I felt like I was climbing into a pocket of air cut off from the rest of the world. The tower appeared around a bend near 3 in the afternoon, leaning skeletal, the wood half silver from rot. It had no business still standing. I walked the perimeter first. Something about the ground struck me. It was hard-packed, as though hundreds of feet had trampled it flat. Yet there were no prints, no fallen branches, no animal scat. The forest around it was silent. Not quiet, silent. You don't notice how alive a mountain usually sounds until all of it vanishes at once. No woodpeckers, no wind in the leaves. Just my own breath. I told myself it was fine, just a trick of nerves, and started up the stairs. They groaned under me, brittle as bones. At the top, the cabin reeked of mildew and old paper. Rusted equipment lay scattered, long abandoned. I took photos quickly, jotting notes, already thinking about the hike down. That's when I noticed something at the edge of the treeline below. At first I thought it was just a trunk catching shadow. But trunks don't shift when you look at them. This shape was tall, too tall and narrow. Like someone had stretched a shadow until it stood upright. I raised my camera, zoomed, and before I could focus, the thing stepped sideways into the trees with a glide too smooth to belong to anything natural. My stomach dropped. I wanted to radio in, but when I keyed it, nothing but static. I tried again. Still static. I stayed in that tower longer than I should have, hoping daylight would sharpen things, hoping I imagined it. But every time I looked back at the trees, I thought I saw the sliver of something black slipping between them. Eventually I forced myself down. Each step creaked like a warning. By the time my boots touched dirt, dusk was already leaning over the ridge. I started fast, trying to retrace the way I came, but something was wrong. The trail twisted differently. Curves fell where they hadn't been. I checked my compass, but the needle spun like a drunk, swinging north then east then south again. That's when I heard the footsteps. Not animal scurries, not the scamper of deer. Heavy, deliberate, matching me stride for stride. I froze. They froze. I walked. They walked. I pulled my sidearm, more for courage than use, and called out, "County Survey, who's out there?" The woods answered with nothing. Then came breathing. Low, wet, like air forced through waterlogged lungs. I ran. Crashed through brush, stumbled over rocks, heart slamming. I knew I was off trail, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. Once I tripped hard on a root, tore my knee open, but I didn't stop. Somewhere in the mess, I dropped my pack. It didn't matter. By the time I saw the glint of my truck's windshield through the trees, I was half mad with relief. I lunged inside, locked the doors, started the engine with shaking hands. And that's when I saw it. It stood at the tree-line where the trail began. No more hiding, no trick of the eyes. Tall, stretched, arms hanging too low, legs too long, had nothing but a smear of black. It didn't move. Didn't need to. It was enough that it was there, watching, making sure I knew it could step closer if it wanted. I tore out of there, didn't look back until I was miles down the county road. When I finally stopped at a gas station, I couldn't stop shaking. The clerk asked if I'd been in an accident. I told him I just slipped on the trail. I filed my report 2 days later. Wrote the tower was unsafe, the trail washed out, the markers missing. I recommended closure. They nodded, stamped it, moved on. Nobody asked questions. 2 weeks later, news broke about a missing teenager near Ashen Fork. Dog turned up at the trailhead. No boy. Search parties combed the ridge. Nothing. When I read it, I deleted the email they sent asking if I'd seen anything unusual. That was 3 years ago. I still dream of that black figure. Sometimes at the tree-line, sometimes closer, sometimes standing just beyond the reflection in a window. Folks in town call it the Tall Watcher. They say it isn't a ghost or a man, but something older, something the mountains keep as their own sentinel. You don't wander near Ashen Fork after dusk, they warn. Not unless you want it to notice you. Me, I don't go back at all. I won't even drive that county road anymore. Because the worst part isn't what I saw that day. It's knowing that whatever it was saw me too. And it hasn't forgotten. My name's Aaron Tate, I'm 31, and back then I was working nights as a security guard at a textile plant outside Kingsport, Tennessee. The shifts were long, the air always smelled faintly of burnt cotton, and the pay was barely enough to cover rent. To stay sane, I had one ritual. On my off days I'd hike. Not the busy trails near the Smokies where tourists packed in with cameras, but the lonely ones. The ones you only heard about through word of mouth, never posted on brochures or blogs. The emptier the better. I wasn't chasing exercise or views. I just needed to walk somewhere that didn't remind me of alarms, time clocks, and steel doors locking shut. It was late October, one of those years when fall came sharp and fast, stripping the trees almost overnight. I found myself digging through old message boards I'd bookmarked back in college. Buried in one was a half-forgotten thread from some user with the handle Raven Chalk, dated back to 2009. The post was about a side trail near Pine Gap Hollow, across the border in southeastern Kentucky. Supposedly, it had once been a survey path cut by logging crews, but was abandoned before it got added to the state maps. According to Raven Chalk, if you kept on it, you'd loop back eventually into a recognized route. But what stuck with me was the way he described it. He wrote, "It's the only place I ever heard silence that felt carved." That phrasing haunted me. Silence carved? What the hell did that mean? Curiosity hooked its claws into me, and before I knew it, I'd plotted a rough starting point from the scraps of coordinates he mentioned. My GPS couldn't find the actual trail, but I figured I could bushwhack enough to spot it. I packed light but thorough. 3 days of supplies, tent, field knife, headlamp, compass, and a cheap revolver I'd picked up from a pawn shop after a scare with some drunks at the plant one night. The drive took me through back roads lined with shuttered gas stations and rusted signage for coal unions long dissolved. By the time I parked on a shoulder of dirt near Pine Gap, the sun was still low, bleeding pale orange across the hills. There were no trail markers, no cars, just brush bent in a way that suggested feet had passed there once, though maybe not in years. That was good enough for me. The forest swallowed me fast. The trail, if you could call it that, was nothing more than a vague corridor where trees leaned away from one another, as though trying to keep something clear. The ground was damp and roots gnarled, but it felt intentional, like the woods wanted me there, but only on this narrow spine of earth. For the first few miles, it was exactly the kind of solitude I craved. No planes overhead, no faint drone of highways, just me and the rhythm of my boots. Then I saw the first board. It was nailed shoulder high into the trunk of a poplar, maybe 6 inches wide, weathered in gray, with the number 9 cut deep into it. No insignia, no arrow, no context. Just the number. I stopped, frowned, and snapped a photo. I assumed maybe an old survey marker. But an hour later, there was another. 8, same style. Same cut. The placement lower this time, close to my hip. That's when I noticed something that curdled my stomach. I hadn't seen a single boot print in the mud. No beer cans, no candy wrappers, nothing human. Worse, no animals either. Usually in woods like this, you see some squirrel chatter, maybe the white flash of a deer's tail. Here, nothing. Just trees pressed tight, and the strange, steady climb of numbers. By the time I reached 6, the sky had thickened with clouds. The board wasn't nailed. It was jammed upright into the earth, tilted like it had been shoved there violently. The gouges in the wood looked fresher, as if whoever carved them had been in a hurry. And the silence. God, the silence. It pressed against my ears like altitude. I kept turning, expecting to see someone standing there, but it was just me and the gray trunks. I told myself I'd push to sundown camp, then turn back in the morning. But around marker 5, I knew I was in trouble. That one wasn't carved. It was painted. A sloppy, angry slash of red across rough board, dripping at the edges like it had only recently dried. The moment I stepped past it, my head rang like I'd just exited a pressurized cabin. My nose started bleeding, hot, fast, sudden. I bent forward, blood soaking my glove as I pinched at it, ears buzzing like I was standing too close to a transformer. My knees shook so bad I thought they'd give. I should have turned back then, but some mixture of pride and stupidity made me press on until I found a patch of clearing and pitched my tent. No fire. It didn't feel right to light one. The air was already thick, like even smoke would hang wrong here. My phone showed nothing but a frozen blue dot. No signal, no movement. I nibbled on a granola bar, staring out at the line of trees, half expecting them to inch closer. Eventually, sleep dragged me down. When I woke, my watch said 1:33 a.m. The time etched itself in my brain. I hadn't stirred to a noise. I was just suddenly, violently awake. My chest hurt from how hard my heart was kicking. Then came the sound. Footsteps. Slow. One every 2 or 3 seconds, circling the tent. Not cautious. Not hurried. Just pacing. I held my breath, hand tight around the knife in my sleeping bag. My mouth was so dry I couldn't swallow. And then a voice came, flat, monotone, but clear. Not whispered. Not shouted. Just spoken, like someone reading my name off a roll call. Aaron Tate. My blood iced. It circled once more. Then again the same voice, same exact cadence, from the opposite side of the tent. My name, flat as a tape recording. I stayed rigid until the first gray of morning light touched the nylon. When I finally unzipped the flap, the woods looked empty again, except for a new board propped against a tree not 15 feet away. It read 4, and beneath the number, scratched faint but legible, was my name. I packed so fast I left half my gear behind. I didn't eat, didn't think, just moved. The trail felt different now, tighter, trees pressing in at odd angles. The sky above looked dimmer, though my watch said it was barely past 8. I forced my way on, but landmarks were gone. The map wouldn't update, the compass spun. I began to hear things ahead of me, branches snapping, the blur of a leg vanishing behind a trunk. But every time I lunged forward, there was nothing. At 2, the board was hanging by twine from a branch, swaying gently as though someone had just let it go. Its back was riddled with tiny punctures, irregular like bite marks. I knocked it down with my trekking pole, barely holding myself together. The forest floor had gone spongy, like I was walking on soaked carpet. Some trees bore charred bark with no fire damage anywhere around them. By the time I stumbled on the 0 marker, my throat locked. It was a jagged splinter of wood jammed into the dirt, burned black around the edges, reeking of melted plastic. And my name wasn't carved, it was branded deep, like it had been seared in with heat. That's when the thing finally showed itself. It darted between the trees 20 yards off, its limbs too long, bending against joints that didn't fit. It moved too fast to be human, too fluid to be animal. Just wrong. I bolted, tearing through brush, lungs searing, ears ringing with the sound of something crashing behind me. At one point, I tripped and skinned my face on a rock, but I didn't stop. Then, through a screen of thorns, I burst into a clearing under a sagging line of power poles. I followed them like a lifeline until at last I hit gravel, then a dirt road. A ranger's pickup rolled up minutes later. The driver rolled down his window, eyes narrowing when he saw my torn face. "You come out of Pine Gap?" he asked. I nodded, shaking. He muttered something under his breath about damn fool kids, and drove me back to my car without asking much else. I didn't tell him about the numbers. Didn't tell him about the voice. Just said I'd gotten lost on an old spur. He told me nobody used that path anymore, that it had been decommissioned after a rock slide 12 years ago. Back home, I checked my phone. The photos I'd taken of the first boards were gone. Not deleted, just missing. The forum thread from Ravenchalk was gone too. Dead link. But when I unpacked what was left of my gear, I found something at the bottom of my bag. The burned Zero board. I don't remember picking it up. I don't remember carrying it. But it was there, blackened, still faintly stinking of chemicals. It's been almost 2 years since then. The board is still in my closet. I've tried to throw it out 3 times. Every time I find it back. Once in my trunk, once under my bed, once leaning against my front door when I got home from work. And last night, for the first time, I dreamed of those woods again. Only this time, when I saw the board, the number wasn't 0. It was my birthday. My name's Luke Hanley. I was 29 when this happened, and at the time I wasn't a ranger or even a forestry worker. I was a contractor, one of those guys the county brings in when they don't want to burn staff hours fixing backcountry odds and ends. Trail signs, broken bridges, mile markers, even the occasional fire pit rebuild. They paid me a small stipend and let me bill my own hours, which meant it wasn't glamorous work, but it gave me a reason to be in the mountains. I liked the quiet. I liked being away from people. That October, I was given a 4-day contract to redo markers and junction posts along a forgotten loop in Laurel Fork, a patch of forest on the Kentucky side of the border where the ridges pressed close together like crooked teeth. Most of it was still on maps, though the western side backed up against an old feeder route that locals just called Money's Cut. It wasn't labeled anymore. Supposedly, the cut had been shuttered decades ago after 2 brothers got lost out there in the 70s and were never found. Folks in town swore Money's Cut was cursed ground. Stories about hikers vanishing, lights in the trees, compasses spinning wild. Every Appalachian hollow has its bogeyman, so I shrugged it off. The first day was routine. I hiked in heavy, lugging a 60-pound pack with bolts, drill, and replacement planks. The air had that brittle autumn bite to it, the kind that burns your lungs if you breathe too fast. By late afternoon I set up camp at a junction where 3 ridges met, the kind of spot that almost looked designed for a tent. I boiled a meal on the stove, stretched my back against a fallen log, and listened to crickets chattering in the dark. Somewhere after midnight, I woke up like a switch had flipped. Not to a noise, not to a dream, just that gut jolt you get when something is wrong. My fire had burned low, glowing embers under ash, and at the very edge of the light, where the shadows thinned into black, there was a figure. Upright, still, watching. My hand slid to the hammer clipped to my belt. No headlamp on them, no pack, no gear. Whoever it was stood there empty-handed. I held their shape in my eyes, refusing to blink. And then nothing. One heartbeat they were there, the next gone. No footfalls. No sound. Just erased. I shot my beam across the tree-line, circled the camp twice. The ground was undisturbed. No broken twigs, no leaf scatter. If someone had been there, they left no trace. I spent the rest of the night on edge, sitting upright with the hammer in one hand and the knife in the other. By morning, I convinced myself I'd been half dreaming. Long day of hauling, dozing light. Maybe I'd seen a crooked trunk at the right angle. I packed up and got back to work. Around midday, I checked the mile marker I'd reset the year before. It wasn't crooked or loose. It had been ripped clean out of the soil. The bolts were still clinging to the splintered base, as though something had torn it out by brute force and flung it aside. I logged it, unsettled, but pushed on. That afternoon I found another post still standing, but bent, warped at the top like hands had gripped it and twisted. The wood wasn't rotted. It was solid oak. No storm would have done that. That night I camped higher up, no fire, just stove oatmeal and my sleeping bag. After midnight, the forest muted itself. Not quiet, mute. Bugs, owls, wind gone. And then the pacing began. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Circling the faint glow of my lamp. A heavy inhale, thick, wet, like someone breathing through drowned lungs. I rose with the hatchet in my fist, calling into the dark that I was armed. Nothing. Then sudden crashing, branches snapping as something retreated down the slope fast. I didn't sleep. At dawn I broke camp, packed without breakfast, and started moving. As I descended, I passed the turnoff toward Money's Cut again. The old post was still there, split and fading. Except now the sign arm had been rotated on its bolts, pointing south where it had faced north the day before. The wood was damp, like someone had gripped it with wet hands. I should have left then, but the contract was 4 days, and stubbornness is a curse all its own. I pushed another half day in before the air shifted. The trail felt strange, narrower, the trees leaning in so close their branches touched overhead. By late afternoon, my compass needle spun without stopping. That night, I didn't pitch the tent. I lay in the open with the blade resting on my chest. The woods died again, dead silence pressing against my ears like cloth. Around 2 in the morning, a voice came. Not shouted, not whispered, just flat, as though someone was reciting. Luke Hanley. Every hair on my neck lifted. The voice came again from the opposite side. Same cadence, same pitch. My name spoken like it was being read off paper. I froze until gray light bled across the ridge. When I finally stood, there was a fresh marker propped against a tree not 10 feet away. Not nailed, not planted. Just leaned there. The number 3 carved into it. And beneath it, my name etched rough. Panic hollowed me. I stuffed my gear any way it would fit and ran the ridge, legs aching, lungs burning. The trail twisted wrong. Turns fell in the wrong places. At one point I reached a gully choked with vines where I swore there had been flat trail before. My GPS refused to budge, screen frozen on a dot I'd already passed miles back. Then the forest bent. Some trees were scorched black at the base but carried green leaves. The ground turned spongy, sucking at my boots like wet carpet. I caught glimpses, an arm sliding behind a trunk, a shoulder ducking back. Too fast, too silent. I found another board dangling from a branch with twine. The number 2 gouged deep. The back riddled with tiny holes like teeth had gnawed it. I knocked it down with my trekking pole and kept moving, half blind with terror. By late afternoon, I stumbled into a clearing under sagging power lines. I followed them like a lifeline, boots slipping on wet stone, until finally I came out on a dirt road. A county truck pulled up within minutes. The ranger leaned out, expression flat. "You come out of Money's Cut?" he asked. I nodded mutely. He just shook his head, muttered something about fools chasing bad ground, and drove me back to my truck. When I got there, the hood bore 5 streaks of mud. Not paw prints, not claws, fingers, long dragged from the grill up to the windshield. I filed my report back in town, listed damaged signs, bent posts, unstable conditions. I left out the figure, the breathing, the boards, the voice. That was 2 years ago. I haven't taken another contract near Laurel Fork since. But I still have the board. I don't remember picking it up, but it was in my pack when I got home. Burned edges. The 0 carved into it. My name beneath. Some nights I wake to silence, so heavy I can't hear my own breath. And I dream of the board again, but the number carved there isn't 0 anymore. It changes, counting up. Last week it read 7. And if the count is going up, then it's not over. It's waiting. My name's Jonah Wells, and I was 34 the year I came back to the mountains of eastern Tennessee, not far from the border with Virginia. I wasn't returning out of nostalgia or any sense of family loyalty. Truth was, I hadn't spoken to anyone in my bloodline for years. But when my aunt called and said my father had died, and that his house out near Black Ash Hollow needed clearing before the bank took it, I agreed. Not because I wanted the keepsakes or even closure, I came because I couldn't shake the thought that the man had gone to his grave without anyone knowing what finally drove him mad. Growing up, Dad was strict, almost cruel, but sane. After my mother left, he unraveled. Folks in town whispered about how he boarded up windows, how he talked about shadows moving in the glass, how he refused to go near certain parts of his own property. By the time I left for college, he was already the town's cautionary tale. I hadn't planned on coming back, but standing at my own bathroom mirror one morning, I caught myself flinching, half expecting it to move wrong. That was enough to make me take the drive down. The road into Black Ash Hollow wound through dying towns, shuttered shops with letters peeled off their signs, gas stations turned to weeds. My father's house sat back from the road, a sagging two-story with blistered siding and a porch that had sunk an inch since the last time I'd been there. Someone had cut the grass recently, but it looked more like obligation than pride. Inside, the air hit me like damp cloth, cedar, mold, and the faint chemical sting of mothballs. My old room hadn't been touched since I was 18. The same lopsided desk, the bed frame groaning under a quilt my grandmother sewed, the same crooked closet door. But the house felt emptier than it should have, like the walls themselves were hollowed out. That first night I couldn't sleep. I lay listening to the fan click every third turn. Around midnight, a smell crawled into the room. Wet earth and iron, like someone had dragged a shovel through bloodied soil. I sat up, heart pounding, but the air went still again. The next morning I started clearing boxes. That's when I saw the glass. It wasn't a mirror exactly. It was an oval pane framed in oak, hung at the end of the upstairs hall opposite the bathroom. I didn't remember it from childhood. The glass wasn't clear. It had a faint green tint, like river water. I raised my hand to test it, and what looked back didn't quite keep up. There was a beat, just long enough to notice, where my reflection decided whether or not to follow. I jerked away, told myself it was poor silvering, bad lighting, a trick of exhaustion. But when I walked past again later, my reflection's head turned just a hair slower than mine, like it was considering me instead of copying. That night, I heard the back door creak. My father had always said the latch was too warped to shut proper, but I hadn't touched it since I arrived. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the kitchen. The wooden door hung open just enough to show the screen latched behind it. Beyond the porch, the yard dipped toward the tree line. The security bulb above me flickered once, twice, then steadied. Something moved between the trees. Upright but wrong, too lurching, too uneven, like a body wearing itself badly. The shoulders pitched with each step, arms swinging too wide. It vanished behind the old shed before I could raise the light. I locked every bolt I could find and sat in the living room until dawn with the TV on low, sound buzzing just enough to remind me I wasn't fully alone. The following morning, I stepped out with coffee and nearly dropped the cup. In the grass were 6 dead starlings, arranged in a perfect hexagon. Not scattered, not killed by a cat. Placed, their wings tucked, their eyes dry and unclouded. I called my cousin May, who'd helped Dad during his last months. I asked her straight out if he'd acted strange before he passed. There was a long silence on the line before she whispered, "Did he ever tell you about the hollow glass?" I told her I didn't know what she meant. "It's that pane in the hall," she said. "He swore it wasn't a mirror. Said it was a window. Claimed it showed things that hadn't happened yet or weren't supposed to. She said he'd started covering it in his last year. Sheets, blankets, anything. He wouldn't walk past it uncovered. That night, I draped a towel over the frame. Within an hour, I found the towel on the floor. I taped another up, but the tape peeled loose without sound, curling like it had been pried by invisible fingers. Finally, I turned the whole frame to face the wall. At 3:07 a.m., I woke choking. The smell was back, stronger, wet fur and vinegar, sour enough to gag. I stumbled into the hallway, and my stomach dropped. The pain faced outward again, but it wasn't showing me. The hallway in the glass was ruined, peeling paper, dangling light, carpet soaked black. My reflection stood in the middle of it, but it wasn't me. Its grin spread too far, eyes bulging wide without a blink, teeth too many and too sharp. I staggered back, heart hammering. The reflection didn't move. It just kept smiling. I ran. Didn't grab shoes, didn't grab the duffel. I tore out the front door barefoot, down the road until I reached the little stone church that had collapsed years ago. I sat on its steps until the first smear of dawn lit the ridge. When I finally worked up the nerve to go back, the front door stood wide open. My duffel bag sat neatly zipped on the porch. No footprints, no scuff marks, nothing disturbed. Inside, the pane gleamed spotless. I forced myself to glance at it once. Just once. The reflection looked normal, me tired, hollow-eyed. But just over my shoulder in the glass, a set of fingers curled along the frame. Not in the hallway, only in the reflection. I left that day. My cousin sold the house for cash. Nobody asked questions, but sometimes when I'm brushing my teeth at night, I catch a hesitation in the mirror above the sink. Just a fraction of a second where my reflection waits before it follows. And I swear, every time it does, it's learning me a little better. My name is Daniel Clay, and when this happened, I was 36, working as a field ecologist for a conservation nonprofit based out of Johnson City, Tennessee. Most of what we did was the unglamorous part of conservation, counting salamanders, checking soil samples for invasive fungus, making sure streams weren't clogged with chemical runoff from old mining sites. I liked the solitude. The mountains were where I felt most like myself. The summer in question, I was sent to monitor a section of forest above Red Hollow, just north of Cherokee National Forest. It was one of those forgotten pockets where the ridges tangled and maps hadn't been updated in decades. I volunteered for the assignment. 2 weeks alone with the trees, a tent, and my notebooks sounded better than being chained to a desk in town. The first days were uneventful. The forest was steep, but not impossible. I set up acoustic monitors for bat surveys, logged bird calls, and checked water quality in a narrow creek that trickled through laurel thickets. I moved between sites with the slow rhythm of someone who's done this a long time. The woods were quiet, heavy with the thick green of late July, cicadas droning so loud they seemed to press against the inside of my skull. It was the third morning when things began to lean wrong. I hiked out to where I'd strapped an audio recorder to a poplar weeks earlier. The strap still clung to the bark, but the device itself was gone. Not smashed, not chewed, just missing, taken clean. I frowned, logged it as possible theft, and tried to dismiss the prickle up my spine. But 20 minutes later, at the next site, I found another monitor not destroyed but ruined in a strange way. Its casing had been opened and every wire pulled loose, splayed across the ground like veins. The memory card was shredded into curls. Animals don't do that. People do. That evening I made camp at a narrow saddle between ridges, a place locals used to call Purgatory Gap. I'd seen the name scrawled on an old TVA map years ago, but thought it was just folk color. The gap had no sound at all. No katydids. No crickets. Just silence so thick my ears rang. I kept the fire higher than usual. Around midnight, I woke with the certain knowledge something was moving outside the tent. The steps weren't bold. They were careful, deliberate, a slow circling in the leaf litter. I waited with my flashlight gripped in one hand, the flare gun in the other. After long minutes of silence, I swept the light. Nothing. But when I cut the beam, the pacing resumed, this time closer. I finally ripped open the zipper and stepped out. The clearing was empty, but the smell hit me, a wet, earthy rot, like soil turned over in a graveyard after rain. I didn't sleep again. The next day I climbed to the high ridge where the third monitor should have been. Only the strap remained. No tracks, no prints, nothing but scuffed moss that suggested something had lingered. Standing there with the silence pressing on me, I thought about a story my grandmother used to tell, about the hollow folk. Not witches, not haints. Just people who lived under the ridges, the second people, she called them, who'd been there before settlers ever laid claim. You'd know them, she said, not by seeing them, but by the way they imitated what they thought humans should look like. Like children copying a game without ever understanding the rules. I hadn't thought about that story in years, but it came back to me sharp as a thorn. I decided to cut the trip short. 6 hours back to the truck, I told myself, and I'd be gone. Halfway out, the trail narrowed onto a shale spine. The drop-offs on either side were sheer. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something pacing along the slope below me. Human-shaped, yes, but its stride was bent and wrong, limbs swinging like they belonged to a body and used to carrying itself. I stopped. It stopped. When I moved again, it mirrored me exactly, keeping pace among the trees. I forced myself not to look down again. I walked faster, every nerve in my back lit up like a fuse. By the time I reached my truck at the old Ranger gate, I was slick with sweat and shaking so badly I nearly dropped the keys. I slammed the doors shut, locked them, and sat for a long minute staring at the trees. That should have been the end of it, but I couldn't leave it alone. Back at headquarters, I reviewed what data I had. Most of it was static, normal forest noise, but one file made me go cold. At 2:13 a.m., the recorder picked up breathing. Not animal panting. Human breathing, shallow, ragged, circling the device. Then a low humming sound, like someone trying to mimic a tune without knowing the melody. After 2 minutes, the audio cut. I never told my supervisor the full truth. I said the monitors were vandalized, probably by squatters. He didn't push. Maybe he didn't want to know. Weeks later, I stopped by a gear shop in Irwin to replace my stove. A guy in line behind me struck up small talk. When I asked where he'd been hiking, he said he'd done a solo night up near Red Hollow. Then he laughed nervously and told me he barely slept because he heard crawling all around his tent. Not walking, crawling. He said it sounded like several people, their breathing fast and close, circling him for hours. At sunrise, he found streaks of dark mud smeared in a ring around his camp. I didn't respond, just paid and left. Now months later, I still haven't gone back into the woods. But the silence hasn't left me. Some nights, when I wake suddenly around 2 a.m., I swear I can hear that ragged breathing just beyond my apartment door. And I wonder if the Hollow folk learned something new from watching me, something they've been waiting to try. My name is Mark Delaney. I'm 40 now, but back in the spring of 2021 I was working seasonal contracts for the State Forestry Service in eastern Kentucky. Before that I'd bounced between jobs, construction, short stints in the Army, security details, but I always ended up drifting back to the mountains. Cities never sat right with me. The endless traffic made my skin crawl, and the press of people in supermarkets or subway stations felt like a hive buzzing in my ears. Out in the hills, things made sense. The forest has a rhythm. Noise carries a reason. I trusted that rhythm. Until the spring I stopped being able to. They sent me to watch over a section of the Cumberland Ridges, not far from a town so small you wouldn't find it on most maps. The locals called it Fenton's Rest, a coal hollow that dried up when the seams went bust. The trailheads that wound through there weren't tourist draws. No signs, no overlooks, just raw ground that either accepted you or didn't. The only real structure was a fire warden's shack about a mile in, built from pine and leaning against itself like an old drunk. That was my post. A cot, a wood stove, a cracked door that rattled if you didn't wedge it. A solar panel powered a radio, and one lantern. That was it. The first week slipped by in silence. My patrols were simple. Hike the loop each morning, clear down branches, check the springs, log sightings of deer, bear, and the occasional hog rooting too close to the trail. I ran into a handful of backpackers, retirees from Knoxville, a wiry guy hiking north with a banjo lashed to his pack. All of them smiled, swapped trail chatter, and moved on. I cooked simple meals, read battered field guides, and let the quiet settle into me. For a while it was perfect. On the 9th night, just as I was stirring beans over the fire pit, I heard boots crunching up the slope behind the shack. That wasn't unusual. Folks sometimes wandered off the main path. But this time I felt the hair lift at the back of my neck before I even saw him. He stepped into the firelight without a word. Mid-40s maybe, though it was hard to tell under the brim of his hat. His coat was a long canvas thing the color of old parchment, the sort of garment you'd see in a faded photo rather than on a modern hiker. His pack was scuffed leather, not nylon, with a bedroll lashed on by fraying rope. His boots were caked with mud that smelled faintly of stagnant water, like he'd been wading through a marsh instead of dry ridged trail. Evening, I said, careful but polite. He repeated it back, evening, flat, as if he was copying the word without understanding it. I asked if he needed water, directions, anything. His head tilted, and after a pause he said, "No, just here for the night." Same steady tone, no inflection. I gestured to the flat patch near the shack where others had camped before. He didn't pitch a tent or unroll his pack. He just lowered himself cross-legged by the fire like a man willing to sit there, motionless, until morning. I offered food. He said he had some but never reached for it. He stared at the flames with unblinking eyes that watered but never closed. "Name's Mark," I tried. His gaze slid sideways, deliberate, and fixed on me longer than felt right. "They call me the telling man. Not my name is. Not even I'm. Just that." I waited for him to laugh, but he didn't. And he never once asked me who I was. By 10 I excused myself, shut the shack's door, and lay on the cot with my knife across my chest. I told myself I'd run into plenty of odd folks in the backcountry before, but I didn't sleep. At 3:17 a.m., I'll never forget the digits glowing faint on my GPS. The latch rattled. The door pushed inward with a slow, steady creak. He stood there in the threshold, brim of his hat brushing the frame, eyes bright in the dark. He didn't look surprised to see me awake. "Don't move," he said. Not a threat, not even command, just a quiet fact. He crossed to the corner table and placed something on it. A knife, long-bladed, the hilt carved from bone so polished it almost gleamed in the moonlight through the window. He sat in my chair and folded his hands. "The mountain brings me back," he said evenly. "Always to someone different. Always to one who listens." My mouth was dry. I managed to croak. "What are you talking about?" He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "It keeps what it doesn't want. And I keep the stories." Then he spoke. For 2 hours, he told me things he shouldn't have known. He recited the last words of a boy lost in a storm near Cane Hollow in 2014, a case I'd searched. He described a woman in a red parka who disappeared along Pine Gap in 2017, down to the brand of her stove and the humming tune she made while boiling water. Details never in the reports. He talked about 2 campers who fought over matches in Milner Gorge. He quoted them word for word. His voice never wavered, his face never shifted. He just cataloged what the mountain had taken. Then he told me something worse. He described a hiker who snored through the night in a yellow tent pitched by a broken spruce. I remembered that tent. I'd been part of that search, too. We'd found only a single boot, half buried near a stump. I'd logged it but left out the rest. I'd found drag marks that looked wrong, too wide for one body. I never told anyone. Yet he knew. The fire in the grate hissed as if water had spilled into it. My chest ached with every word. Finally he rose, picked up the bone-handled knife, and held it as if testing the weight. "Not tonight," he said simply. He opened the door and walked out into the black ridge without a glance back. I sat there until daylight, afraid that if I blinked he'd reappear in the chair. At sunrise I radioed for extraction. They sent a chopper. I gave a report, every detail I could force out of my dry mouth. They searched. They found no prints but mine. No leather pack. No campsite. Just a trail of wet boot marks leading to the river and vanishing at the bank. I was pulled from field work, assigned to a desk in Frankfurt. Stress leave, they called it. 3 months later, a ranger out near the Virginia line radioed in. He'd seen a man in a long canvas coat, standing just beyond his fire. Mid-40s, gray in his hair, no tent, no pack except old leather. By the time a crew got there, the camp was empty. I don't argue with people anymore about what's real in the mountains. The stories live longer than we do. I don't step off the main trails alone, and I don't camp without someone else close enough to shake me awake if I start hearing voices. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and the night's too still, I wake at 3:17 a.m. exactly. The air will feel thick, and for a moment I swear I hear boot steps circling the porch. And I know, when the mountain wants me back, the telling man will come sit in my chair again. My name is Ethan McBride, and when this happened I was 32. I worked contract jobs as a cartographer's assistant, basically field mapping for private landowners who wanted surveys done where county records were decades out of date. Most of the time it was boring grunt work, hiking ridges, recording elevations, sketching rough terrain notes, tagging coordinates for crews who'd come later. The pay wasn't much, but it was solitary. I liked that. Being alone in the hills always felt safer than being crammed in a city. Last September, I got assigned to chart an abandoned stretch of mountain near the West Virginia line, tucked between Laurel Fork and the Tug Valley. The company had purchased right-of-way through the hollows, probably for logging roads or mineral testing. My role was simple: walk 15 miles across ridges and valleys, record the land's contour, flag possible routes, and camp out as needed. They estimated a 5-day trip. I packed for 7. The first 3 days passed without issue. The woods were deep, but not unfriendly. I crossed laurel thickets and rock spines where hawks wheeled overhead. I startled a black bear cub once, and its mother crashing downslope kept me sharp, but nothing unusual. At night I pitched my tent, boiled simple meals, and wrote notes by headlamp. There was a comfort in the repetition. On the fourth morning, I found the first sign that things weren't routine. About 5 miles in, I noticed prints in the soil along a faint deer path. Boot prints. Not mine. They were fresh enough that the edges were sharp, no weathering, no crumbles. The tread wasn't a brand I recognized, and they pressed deep into the heel, like whoever made them carried a lot of weight. I radioed base, just in case another surveyor had been sent in. Negative. Nobody else scheduled. This wasn't public land. Nobody had permission to be out there but me. Still, I told myself maybe it was a hunter. People wander where they shouldn't all the time. I kept moving. By evening I camped beneath a ridge shoulder, a flat stretch with decent sight lines. I was careful to place reflective markers around the perimeter like I always did, so if anything moved in the dark, I'd catch the gleam. I ate quickly, doused the stove, and turned in. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to the sound of twigs snapping. Not once. Several. Slow. Deliberate. I lay still, heart thudding. It wasn't wind. There was no wind that night. Something was pacing. For steps across to the right. Stop. For steps back. Stop. I held the flare gun in one hand, my knife in the other, and waited. The pacing shifted. Now the sound was on the opposite side of the tent. I forced myself to unzip the flap half an inch, shone my light quick and low. Nothing. But when I stepped outside slowly, scanning the clearing, I saw them. 2 boot prints. Fresh. 10 feet from the tent, facing it directly. No trail led in. No drag marks out. Just 2 perfect prints pressed into the soil. By morning, I packed and left without breakfast. I took a sharper descent down the ridge to get away faster, cutting miles from the planned route. It was late afternoon when I found the tape. Bright orange surveyor's tape, the same kind I carried on my belt. Only mine were always tied single, loose, easy to spot. This one was knotted carefully, twice, into a loop that looked practiced. It hung at chest height from a birch limb. I didn't tie it. There were no tracks beneath it, no scuff marks, just the tape turning slightly in the breeze. That night I didn't sleep. I didn't pitch the tent either. I sat against an oak, flare gun loaded, back straight, waiting. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it, breathing. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Slow, heavy, deliberate inhales. Just behind the tree line. 10 feet, maybe less. Each breath was exaggerated, like someone trying to demonstrate how a human should sound. Then a low voice, flat and toneless, spoke my name. Once. Ethan. I froze. My name carried out of the dark, like it had been plucked from my own mouth. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I waited, hands shaking so bad the flare gun rattled against my knee. The breathing stopped. The voice didn't return. When dawn lit the ridge, nothing was there. No prints. No disturbance. Just silence. I decided right then I was done. Forget the contract. Forget the paycheck. I wasn't finishing the route. I veered east, aiming for an old ranger station I remembered marked on a paper topo map. It would add 2 days of rough terrain, but I'd rather bushwhack than stay another night where the prints had been. By noon I was slogging through a gully of loose rock when I saw it again, tape. Another piece of orange ribbon tied high, knotted double, dangling like a signal. No path led to it, no prints around it. The sight made my throat tighten until I nearly choked. I didn't stop to look longer. I just kept walking. That night, I leaned against a sycamore, eyes burning from lack of sleep. Every so often, I thought I heard rustling. Whenever I turned my headlamp, the woods were still. My nerves frayed so badly that by dawn I barely trusted my own eyes. The 6th day, staggering with exhaustion, I reached the ranger station. A squat cinder block building with a green tin roof, old but solid. 2 rangers were there, logging maintenance notes. They looked me over, mud-caked, trembling, barely upright, and asked what happened. I got turned around. I lied at first, but my voice cracked, and one of them, an older man with a white beard, studied me carefully. "You came through the hollow, didn't you?" he said flatly. I hesitated. "Yeah, I cut across it." He exchanged a look with the other ranger. "You're the fourth in 2 months," he said quietly. I frowned. "Fourth what?" He leaned closer. "Fourth surveyor to come out early. One swore somebody trailed him at night. Another turned up with a busted ankle and refused to explain. The last wouldn't talk at all, just quit the job. You're the only one who walked out without being carried." I didn't answer. Couldn't. He didn't press me. He only said, "That hollow's been off since my daddy's time. Some say it belongs to the echo folk. You hear them when they start using your voice." I left that station with a ride back to my truck. I told myself I'd never set foot in that hollow again. But here's the part one can't shake. It's been nearly a year. I live in a town now, far from the ridges. I sleep with the windows locked. Yet once in a while, just before I drift off, I hear it. A slow inhale. A slow exhale. My own name spoken flat as stone, from a place just past the door. The rangers called them the echo folk. Folks who don't walk the earth the way we do. Folks who listen first, and then learn. And lately, I've started to wonder how much of me they've already learned. My name is Sarah, I'm 31, and I teach environmental science at a small college in eastern Tennessee. Every spring after finals, I take a week for myself. Not beaches, not big city trips, just the woods. I disappear into them. I carry a tent, a camp stove, and a stack of battered field notebooks I've kept since high school. It's the one time I can unplug, remind myself I'm not just a name on faculty emails or a body stuck in grading marathons. My family doesn't get it. They call it reckless, dangerous. But solitude has always been the only way I can really hear myself think. Last May, I chose a stretch of land in the Cumberland Plateau, a section I hadn't camped before. It wasn't far from Pickett State Forest, though the trail I wanted wasn't maintained anymore. An old Forestry Service road dead-ended at a gravel shoulder. And from there, the way in was just a faint path you could only follow if you trusted the old topo lines and a compass. No signs, no markers, no casual campers. I wanted that. I wanted to feel small. The first 3 days were as I'd hoped, quiet, simple, rhythmic. I set up on a shelf near a ridge where the trees opened into a natural clearing, a creek running maybe 200 feet below. I fished, read by firelight, let the wood's silence seep into me until even my own thoughts slowed. For the first time in months, my heart didn't race like I was being graded. On the fourth afternoon, I made a mistake. There was a gulch I'd passed before, steep and narrow, and I'd always avoided it. The mouth was choked with brush, and it gave me that instinctive don't feeling. But after days of routine, I was restless. I convinced myself it was just geology. What could be harmful about a gully? I pushed through the brush and began working my way down. About half a mile in, I saw them. 13 stone stacks, each about knee-high, built from flat river rock, balanced with eerie precision. They were arranged in a semicircle, facing an ancient hemlock bent crooked over the slope. They weren't messy cairns left by kids. They looked deliberate, worshipful almost. No trail led to them, no prints in the soil, just those 13 little towers, waiting in the brush like an audience holding its breath. I stood there too long. My skin prickled like I'd walked in on something mid-prayer. I snapped 2 photos, then turned back uphill, faster than I meant to. That night, I fell asleep early, but sometime after 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound that cracked through my dreams. A single step, dry leaves snapping under weight, then silence. I sat up, listening hard. Nothing. Not crickets, not owls, not wind. The whole forest had gone still, the kind of stillness that makes your ears buzz. I fumbled for my flashlight, but I didn't switch it on right away. I held my breath and waited. When I finally flicked the beam and unzipped the flap, the trees looked the same as they had the night before. But the silence pressed at me unnatural. I sat awake until dawn, unable to shake the certainty that something had paused just outside. When daylight finally came, I crawled out barefoot and nearly tripped over them. 2 stone stacks. The same size, the same style as in the gulch. Placed neatly 15 feet from my fire pit. My throat locked. There were no drag marks. No scattered soil. No sign of how they got there. I snapped. I kicked them down, sent rocks flying into the brush like a tantruming child. Rage was easier than fear. But my stomach twisted at the thought that someone, or something, had stood by me while I slept and built them. I packed my gear fast, faster than I ever had, shoving everything into my pack with shaking hands. I didn't eat breakfast. I just left. That evening, I made camp on a less ideal slope a mile out, one I hadn't used in years. The incline tilted awkwardly, but it gave me a better view downhill. I wanted distance, visibility. I ate cold protein bars. No fire. Boots laced, flashlight resting on my chest, bear spray by my hand. I didn't sleep. At 1:43 a.m., it came again. Not a step this time. A whistle. One note, high-pitched and steady, held for maybe 10 seconds before cutting off. Not a tune. Not a bird call. A human whistle, deliberate and flat. My body went rigid. I unzipped the tent, just enough to listen. Then came laughter. A woman's laugh. Soft, distant, but wrong. Too flat, too clipped. Like a recording played through a broken speaker. The same burst of sound, looping over and over, no joy, no variation. Just a broken echo of what laughter should sound like. I clutched the spray so hard my hand cramped. After a minute, it stopped. Silence again. At first light, I packed. No food. No brushing my teeth. Just packed. But when I shouldered the bag, I realized I'd left my backup sat phone. It was zipped under a tarp pouch I'd buried deep in my gear. I cursed, stood there arguing with myself. Logic said to leave it. But stubbornness won. I went back. The camp was exactly where I'd left it. But every piece of my gear was gone from the tent and laid in a perfect circle around the fire pit. Not tossed, not rifled. Arranged. The cook set, the tarp, the flashlight, my toothbrush, each one set upright, evenly spaced. And around the circle were 13 new stone stacks. Perfect height. Perfect balance. 13 again. I didn't touch them. I didn't move closer. I stepped back into the trees, heart pounding. And that's when I heard the breathing. Heavy. Uneven. Like someone forcing air through a ruined throat. Too close. I dropped behind a log and froze. And then I saw it. A shape, pale against the trees. Too tall, too thin, its limbs elongated like it had grown wrong. It moved without weight, gliding just above the forest floor. It paused by my fire ring, tilting its head as if listening. I backed away inch by inch until I was out of sight, then I ran. I thought I was clear, but an hour later, it crossed the trail ahead. 40 yards out, slipping between the trees. Its arms hung lower than they should, its legs bent backward at the knee. Its skin gleamed like stretched parchment, translucent against the sun. I dropped flat behind a stump, choking on my own breath. It didn't turn. It didn't look. It just slid through the clearing and vanished. I waited 10 minutes before moving again. Then I ran until my chest burned. By late afternoon, I staggered into the gravel shoulder where my car waited. I threw everything into the back seat without sorting it. I drove until I found gas station lights. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't file a report. But here's the part one can't leave behind. I never retrieved the sat phone. It's still out there, zipped beneath that tarp. And sometimes, late at night, when my apartment is still, I wake to a whistle in the dark. One note, high and flat. And if I lie there long enough, the laugh follows. People in the local towns have a name for the thing in those hollows. They call it the Gather. Not because it hunts, because it collects. Stones, gear, voices. Pieces of people. And I think, somewhere in the plateau, it's still building its circle. Waiting for me to come back and fill the last place. My name is Daniel Keene. I'm 37 now, but back when this happened I was working as a contract surveyor for a small timber company out of Hazard, Kentucky. They'd hire me to walk parcels that hadn't been touched in decades. Patches of forest that were half forgotten, sometimes still deeded to families who hadn't set foot there in generations. My job was simple: hike the boundaries, flag potential road cuts, and make notes on terrain. The kind of work nobody else wanted, because it meant carrying a 50-pound pack into the deep woods for days at a time. I didn't mind. I'd spent my whole life around these hills, and the silence was easier on me than any office job. In the fall of 2019, I drew an assignment on the far edge of the Cumberland Mountains, a section of land the company had just acquired. It was 9 miles in from the nearest service road, and the old logging maps I was given were barely legible. The foreman shrugged when he handed me the packet. "Half this tract ain't been walked since the 70s, he said. "Mark what you can. If it looks too rough, we'll pass." That kind of indifference should have been my first warning. I started out early one cool October morning, the air sharp with the smell of damp leaves. The first few miles felt routine, narrow deer paths, laurel thickets clawing at my jacket, a steady climb up ridgelines. By noon, I was on a shelf where the trees opened enough to show me layers of mountains fading into haze. That's when I noticed it, the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was absence. No chickadees in the branches, no woodpeckers, not even the gnats that usually swarm your ears. Just the crunch of my boots and the hiss of my breath. I told myself it was elevation or season, but deep down my gut already knew better. A few miles further, I came across the first marker. It wasn't one of mine, just a splintered board nailed crooked into a poplar. The wood was old, darkened with weather, but the grooves cut into it were fresh. Symbols, not letters, not numbers, but curling marks that made my eyes ache to follow. I'd been in the woods my whole life, and I'd never seen anything like them. I should have walked on. Instead, I veered off the main trace, following a faint path that wound north. The trail narrowed into a tunnel of brush, and after 15 minutes, I stepped into a clearing I didn't expect to find. There was a structure there, a cabin of sorts. Not park-built, not company-built. Logs dark with age, roof half caved in, moss crawling up the sides. The door hung slightly open, shifting with the breeze. I called out. Nothing. I stepped closer, put my hand on the frame. The wood was warm, warmer than it should have been in that chill air. Inside was one room, dirt floor, a bench broken in the corner. But what made my skin crawl were the walls. Every inch of them was carved. Hundreds of gouges, symbols etched so deep the logs looked flayed. Some were new, edges sharp. Others were faded, layered over like generations of hands had been at work. In the far corner, the floor dipped down. I crouched, stomach clenching. A shallow pit had been dug. At its bottom lay bones, clean, white, arranged in a careful pattern. Not animal. Human. I stumbled back into the daylight while burning my throat. That's when the forest moved. Not footsteps. Not a deer bounding away, but heavy thumps above me in the canopy. Branches flexing, leaves shaking as if something large was traveling from tree to tree. Always just out of sight. I bolted back toward the trail, lungs tearing. When I reached it, I saw a boot print in the dirt. Fresh. Too fresh. Dead center of the path. Facing the way I'd come. I don't remember drawing my machete, but it was in my hand. I forced myself to keep moving. No stopping, no brakes. The trail wound into switchbacks along a steep ridge, and every time I glanced downslope, I caught glimpses. A figure pacing parallel to me through the trees, keeping stride but never showing fully. Each time I focused, it melted behind trunks. Finally, on a long straight stretch, I stopped and crouched, trying to steady my breathing. Nothing. Dead still. Then a branch cracked behind me. I spun. 20 feet away stood a man. Tall. Thin. His clothes were wrong. Boots loose on his feet, jeans torn, shirt hanging in tatters like he'd been wearing them for years without change. No pack, no tools, no gear. Just him. His eyes were too wide, unblinking, reflecting light they shouldn't have. And he smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was the drawn-back grimace of something trying to remember how. I raised my blade. He didn't flinch. He just stepped once toward me. Then, with a jerk that didn't look natural, he bolted up slope, crashing through the brush faster than I thought possible. I counted to 60, forcing myself not to break. Then I ran. The last mile was a blur of whipping branches and pounding heart. Every sound behind me made my nerves spark. I burst onto the service road drenched in sweat, throat raw from sucking cold air. I didn't stop until I was inside my truck, doors locked, hands shaking on the wheel. When I wrote my report, I marked the tract as inaccessible. Unsafe. Recommended closure. Nobody asked questions. But here's the thing I've never told anyone. 2 months later, I woke in the middle of the night at home to a sound outside my window. A single creak, like a boot settling on floorboards. I froze, and in the glass of that window, reflected against the dark, I saw it for just a second, my own face smiling back at me. Wide. Too wide. There's a name whispered around these ridges, one my grandfather used to mutter when he warned us not to wander too far at dusk. He called them the Hollow Men. Not ghosts, not animals, but people the mountains swallowed and gave back wrong. I used to think it was just old folklore. Now I sleep with the lights on, and I haven't gone into the backcountry alone since.